Hey, folks, welcome, welcome. Hope you've had a great week thus far and that you're surviving it okay. And yeah, check it out. We're getting on toward the end of the semester. We've got, what, I guess a couple of weeks until Thanksgiving, right? And we get a little bit of a break then. Then we have just a week or two left and then finals. And I'm going to take care of course, you take care of you all throughout that. That's great. So, Nicole, sounds like you can see and hear me great. I love the way you jump on that. Thank you. Alma, great to have you along. Shalise, as always, tremendous. Glad to have you guys along. Yeah, been kind of a funky, oh gosh, funky couple of days for me. We have a family member in the hospital with COVID, and you know, one of our older family members, and so we're kind of stressed about that. That's going on. And then yesterday, my 19-year-old daughter, she and her brother have an apartment, and and she has a couple of cats. Well, one of the cats, just a 6-year-old cat, his kidneys failed, and so she took him into the vet. They tried to figure out what to do, but ultimately there really wasn't anything they could do. And so here my 19-year-old girl is having to go through the whole trauma of putting an animal down. And it's like, all right, so I had a dog. I have two dogs now, as you know, but I had a dog a few months ago that, we had for 12 years, and he finally had to leave, and that was hard for me, and I'm like a 55-year-old curmudgeon, right? And so I'm just thinking about my poor daughter having to do this. 2020 has been a lot of facts of life sort of stuff, hasn't it? But you've been doing fantastic, guys. I like how engaged you've been from the very beginning. And so I appreciate all your thoughts, Shalise and Alma and Ash. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, 6 years is really young for a kitty cat. I know, right? We had a cat one time that lasted like, I think 18 or 19 years. Oh my gosh. Oh, crazy. Yeah, Shalise had to put a dog down in June. It's tough. It's really hard. It's really hard. But yeah, my father says, my father, who's a big, big, big animal person, says that putting your animal down is the last act of love that you show him or her. And I think that's poignant. So I didn't mean to get all down and so forth. What I'm really trying to say is it's been a rough year. It's been a rough semester. We've all gone through a whole lot, and I really appreciate you sticking with this class, sticking with the material, sticking with the assignments. You've been Johnny on the spot from day one, and it's been fantastic. And I truly appreciate that, since check out this medium. This is pretty funky, and the only way to really interact is through comments and so on. But you've been doing absolutely fantastic. Nicole said, little sister's husband passed away from COVID. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's rough. I don't want to think about this it's my father-in-law who's in the hospital, and it's like, oh gosh. I don't want to think about that. I'm really, really, really close to my in-laws. But you know what? We're sticking through it. We're doing the right things. We're social distancing. We're wearing our masks. We're washing our hands. And yeah, post-COVID issues, that's a real thing too. But we're going to get through this. All right. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with this class so freaking well all through the semester. It's not a little thing. Don't think this has been a little thing. Okay. All right, so let's get started on that cheery note, right? So we'll go ahead and reset these from my previous class. Okay, we're still talking about human resource management today, but what we're doing is we are focusing today on expats, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So last time when we met, last Tuesday, I guess it was, we said, hey, are you going to fly out to wherever you're doing business and kind of get this thing started? Well, that's the ethnocentric model, which might be the right model for you. Or are you going to hire somebody locally in that country to run this? That's kind of the polycentric view. Or are you going to find somebody in another country to then go to the country where you're doing business and run things like India and in Singapore with the boxes, right? That's the geocentric view. Well, regardless if you're doing ethnocentric, you going out there, or geocentric, you finding somebody in another country to go out there, you're going to be sending foreigners abroad to a foreign country. What's involved in that? Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit today, and that's the wrong button. Let's get the right button, and let's go ahead and get ourselves a highlighter here. Okay, expats. So let's define what we mean by expatriate employee, or expat. Okay, a citizen of one country working abroad in another. All right. Now, just so you know, when I was a kid living in England, my mother, and I'm like, I think 13 years old. My mother is saying, "Oh yeah, this pub over here, this is where all the expats hang out, and this area over here, this is where all the expats shop." And my mother, who was an American living in England, she was an expat. But now, as a kid, I didn't know the term expat, and in my head, it was like, okay, that's expatriate as in patriotic, no longer patriotic, expatriate. And to me, I kind of had this bad feeling of, oh, yuck, why are you leaving your home country, expatriate? It's not expatriate as in patriotic, it is expatriate, okay? Somebody who is living abroad, okay? So a citizen of one country working abroad in another, all right? Now, I'll give you an example, and actually this is kind of a different example. Well, I'll explain later. Let's talk about this. Okay, India. This is India, okay? This is back in, when I was with Intel. So this is India HR. So we've got Indian, because we're in India. But we've got this one dude right here, right there. Well, he doesn't look Indian. No, he's not. He's from Israel, okay? So he is Israeli, living in India, managing that team. Now, since Intel is an American company and an Israeli living in India managing this team, that's an example of a geocentric staffing model, right? You just find the right talent to go do the job. It doesn't matter where that talent is from or where that talent is going. So his name is Ronan Benheim, good friend of mine now. Of course, he's in Israel, so I don't see him that often, but we still stay in contact. Ronan Benheim, living in India, managing that team, okay? That's an expat, but there's a nuance to it I'll explain in a moment. Now, another way to think of expats in a way that you might be more familiar with is imagine LDS missionary serving a mission in a foreign country, okay? That's an expat, all right? So, you see that young kid right there? That's me about, 400 or 500 years ago, living in Japan, serving an LDS mission in Japan. That is a form of expat, okay? So, as we go on, let's talk about expats. I have been an expat, not just with my time in Japan as a missionary, but I was an expat in Malaysia for a short while. I have worked with many, many expats. I was a student in Japan. I guess that's an expat. I wasn't working for a company, but the point is, not Japan, France. So I've lived in 5 different countries, including the US, so 4 as an expat of some sort or another. Well, let's think about some of the risks around this. First, the attrition rate among expat managers is nearly twice as high as domestic managers. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, I mean, all right, if you have a bunch of, let's take Intel, for example. If Intel has a bunch of managers here in the US and the attrition rate, meaning how often they leave the company, is say 5%, well, when they're expat, it'll be about 10%. All right. It's really, really, really tough to be an expat. We need to think about this because if you get on an airplane and fly out there and live there for 6 months, or if you hire somebody in another country to go out there and live there for 6 months, you need to understand, the trials with this, right? So, a lot of reasons why U.S. expats fail, right? One is inability for the spouse to adjust. Now, we're going to talk about this more, but let me just kind of explain this a smidge. I'll give you an example of my friend Nathan, who actually his spouse adjusted just fine, but I'll use her as an example. So Nathan and his family, his wife, and I think at the time 5 kids or something like that, they moved to Malaysia for a year. They moved to Malaysia to work with, for Intel, and the whole family went. Well, now here's the thing with Nathan. Nathan, he just gets up in the morning, he goes into the Intel site and works 12 hours a day, and then comes back home. Now, when you're at an Intel site, like an Intel fab or office or something, every Intel site in the world looks exactly the same. And every Intel site in the world has a mix of Americans and Indians and Malaysians and folks from Israel and Great Britain and so on. So it's just a mix of people at every single Intel site in the world. They're a very geocentric company. So that means that whether Nathan is getting up in the morning in the US and going into work, or getting up in the morning in Malaysia and going into work, it's more or less the same experience. Same sort of people, same buildings, same pictures, same culture, same everything. That's not the case for his wife, Jen. Okay, now I want to reiterate, Jen and the kids did great. They did fantastic. But it is a different deal for Jen, right? How do you go shopping? You might think that's a ridiculous question, but the way you shop in different countries is different. How do you get around? Do you have a car? Is it taxi? How do you do that? What happens if the electricity goes out or the power goes out? What happens if there's an emergency? If one of the kids splits his head open, right? How do you manage that? What's on TV? Nothing that you can watch, right? Even the very, very basic elements of going about a day-to-day life are completely upended. And for the spouse who might be a tag-along to the manager working as an expat overseas, that upended life is profound. And so spouses often struggle, okay? Sometimes the manager just can't adjust, the person that you've hired to go on out there, because, there's still challenges there, right? It takes a really, really, really high level of emotional intelligence and maturity to work as an expat overseas. I cannot overemphasize this enough. You need to have culture shock figured out. You need to have a profound understanding of the differences and how to work with people. You need to be, and you're going to be surrounded by people who do not have culture shock figured out and who do not have an understanding of your culture and so on and so forth. And so it's going to be really, really difficult. All right. I cannot overstress this. Alma says, I had a friend in Brazil whose husband worked at an embassy during the upheaval. Wow, a few years ago. She had a hard time finding food. They got her and the kids out because of emergency situation. Alma, that is a fantastic, so contributor, fantastic real world example, right? And by the way, we had Shalise in there as well with some great comments. And we also had, let's see, another, yes, I'm sorry, I'm now catching up. Ash and Nicole as well. So we're going to throw those on in there. Great. All right. Very, very, very good. Very good. And you know what? I think that's all of our contributors because I think that's everybody who's on with us right now. So we're going to count that, folks. We're going to totally count that. Do me a favor, send me an email that says 101610. An email that says 101610, and there'll be a little something extra in the stocking for you. Okay, let's continue on. Inability to cope with larger overseas responsibilities. Okay, this one is significant as well. When you're working overseas, that is really, really, really expensive for the company. Sending an expat overseas and that family and so forth, it is a major, major investment. And so, frankly, they're going to work the hell out of you. All right? It's just understand that you will be working 70 to 80 hour weeks, 80-hour weeks. It's just the nature of the beast. All right. They've sent you out there. There's a job to be done. Nobody else can do the job. If somebody else could, they wouldn't have sent you. So there's a lot riding on your shoulders there. And a lot really have a difficult time dealing with those additional responsibilities. So that's something to bear in mind there. Okay. So what do you do to help this out? You got to mitigate these risks. These are real risks. Do not underestimate them. So what are you going to do to mitigate them? Well, you definitely need to go through some cultural training. If you are going to go overseas and, launch this company of yours, I know for a lot of you, this is just a hypothetical example for an assignment, but for one or two of you, you might actually consider doing this, right? Well, make sure you get the right cultural training, right? You want to develop an appreciation for the host country's culture, including their history, political, economic, religious, social, business practices, so forth. It's not just, oh, I love the food in South Africa. Oh, I love the weather in Singapore. Actually, you'll never like the weather in Singapore. No. It's not superficial like that. You need to get deep. You need to really take the time to understand these folks and to understand how work is done there. Because remember, all business is about relationships, and relationships are built on trust, and trust is built on a mutual understanding of each other. So you really need to go there. All right. So you do that. You'll also want to consider some language training. By the way, Shalise says it's really interesting. Being in Africa for 3 months really opened my eyes to the culture. Yeah, you think, oh wow, it's just you think you know about a country, but then when you spend that much time there, you really get in deep. Great example. Language training. Here's the thing. In most places, English really is the language of business. All right. I've traveled all over the world, And just about everywhere, English has been the language of business. And that makes it really tempting to say, oh, language? No, don't have to worry about it. No, 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 no. You really ought to take the time to learn some basic words, basic phrases, basic terminology or sayings and so forth in that host language, because it will really help you build trust with these folks. Yes, they know that you don't have to learn the language, but the fact that you've tried and that you have, that you're going out of your way and experiencing your own discomfort and being vulnerable to them by speaking in their language a little bit really goes a long way in showing that you don't see yourself as American centric, the ugly American syndrome, right? Absolutely. So I recommend you do that. And oh gosh, I forget the language in Afrikaans. Yeah, Afrikaans in South Africa. In Singapore, it's so many freaking languages. Singapore is like this hodgepodge of people, right? So take your pick almost there. Ash says, I get sad, simple version of that when watch people vlog themselves eating food from around the world. Yeah, that's a really good real world example. And we also had another awesome comment. Very good. Okay. Then you got to really think about practical training. This one is overlooked so much, okay? Because everybody loves the idea of cultural training because that's exciting, it's cool, it's cute, and it's almost like trivia and fascinating. And then language, okay, I can wrap my mind around the idea that language is necessary. But practical training, especially for a spouse, right? So, Shalise, if you go out to South Africa and you're working, 80-hour days for a month to get this business off the ground, your husband's going to be kind of like, what the hell do I do? Right? And, and he'll go off and get himself in trouble somehow or another. But, he needs to have some sort of practical training as well. Helping expat families ease into the day-to-day life in the host country, establish routines, connecting with communities, and navigating in this new country, okay? How do you call a taxi? How do you get around? How do you pay for something at the register? Don't think for a moment that paying for something at a register is done exactly the same everywhere around the world. It is not. Do these people haggle? How do you haggle, right? Alma, it's been fascinating to learn Mandarin Chinese. You learn so much more about the Chinese culture and their values. Yes, so Alma, I actually, and boom, there's our comment, and it's real world. So we're going to go ahead and give ourselves another celebration. You guys are on fire today. I'm loving it. I took Mandarin for a short while. I think only like 2 semesters a trillion years ago. And fascinating language. And what really struck me about Mandarin is how important the tonality was, right? All these words were pronounced the same, but depending on where you set the tone, it would change the meaning of the word. One of my favorite things to say is when you put the emphasis on a different syllable. And it's a great example of how just by tone, emphasis on a syllable, well, that's emphasis on a syllable, same word, but the fact that I put the emphasis in a different place and the tone almost made the words unrecognizable. Chinese does that all over the place. So Alma, yeah, totally, right? Okay, so you got to worry about your expat training. You really need to do that. And that is everything I wanted to go over. I do want you to, in your papers, talk a little bit about how you plan to do this. And I mean a little bit. I'm not looking for a great, big, huge training plan. I'm just looking for recognition from you guys that as you do your ethnocentric or polycentric or geocentric staffing model here to launch the company, that you are taking into account the challenges and particular needs of an expat assignment. And so you really want to make sure that you've at least accounted for that, okay? Once again, I am not looking for excruciating detail here. I'm just looking for you to say, yes, we recognize it, and we will put something in place to mitigate for these risks, okay? Now, Alma also says, by the way, there are companies that do this type of training. There actually are. There are companies that do full-on cultural, language, practical training, and so forth. By the way, I have a book. It's a fiction book. It's crap. It's crap. I'm not even gonna. You can probably find it on Amazon if you really looked and so on and so forth. You don't want it. It's fiction, right? And the main protagonist of this novel, he actually was the CEO and owner of a cultural training company. And so his job was to work with various government agencies and companies and so on and so forth, providing cultural training to their employees. And so, yeah, there are companies out there. And in my mind, I always thought it'd be really cool to start a company like that. Well, I didn't start one, but I wrote a story about a guy who did. All right. So, yeah, you don't want to read it. Don't worry. Okay, folks, that's it. That's all for this week. Like I say, nice and straightforward. We've only got like 2 weeks of lectures left. And so that means what we are going to be doing is spending a lot more time on the paper, and we will be preparing for the final. I'm going to go through the final just like we did before. We're basically going to go through all the questions and help you formulate the answers to it. So when the time comes, we're going to be totally set there. All right? So short day. I'm going to stick around for a moment. If there's any questions or comments, or if you want to hook up on Zoom afterwards, we can totally do that. Otherwise, have a great day, and more importantly, a great weekend when the time comes. All right? We'll see you later.